Let's get started. Story number 1.
I never liked being alone at night, but I always told myself it was just a matter of getting used to it. After moving to this apartment in the middle of the city, I figured the loneliness would eventually fade. It didn't. If anything, it grew more pronounced. It wasn't a huge place, but it was all I could afford, a one-bedroom in an old building on the outskirts of downtown. The walls creaked with every gust of wind, and the windows rattled when the trains passed by. But it was quiet at night, and that was the problem. The kind of quiet where you could hear every little noise, every shift in the air, every creak and groan from the old beams. It felt like the building had a life of its own, like it was breathing with me, sometimes slow and steady, and other times almost as if it were waiting. It was after 1 a.m. when I finally decided to turn in for the night. I'd been working on a freelance project, my laptop the only source of light in the apartment. My eyes were sore from staring at the screen too long, and the clock in the corner of the room mocked me as it clicked past midnight. I stretched, letting out a yawn, and got up from the desk, deciding it was time for bed. The apartment was dark, and I felt the sudden weight of the silence. I turned off my laptop, but as I did, I heard something. It was a soft sound, but it made me stop. A kind of tapping, faint, like a pencil or a nail hitting the floor. I glanced over my shoulder, but the apartment was empty. Just the dim glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows on the walls. There was no one there. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the building settling. A pipe, a gust of wind, a neighbor moving around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I made my way to the bedroom and shut the door behind me, pulling the blanket up to my chin. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, the tapping came again. Closer this time. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a pipe. It sounded like it was coming from inside the room. I sat up, my heart thumping in my chest. The room was dark, pitch black except for the faint light coming through the cracks in the blinds. But now I could hear it clearly, a gentle tapping sound, as if something or someone was knocking on the wall just behind my bed. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the house settling, just old pipes or electrical wires. But it kept going. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was unmistakable, like fingernails against the wall. My skin prickled, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" I whispered, but my voice felt weak in the stillness of the room. No response. Of course there wouldn't be. I was alone. Still, the tapping persisted, now louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just knocking. It was as if something was trying to get my attention, like it was beckoning me. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, fingers trembling as I unlocked it. I didn't know who I could call. What could anyone possibly say? But I needed to hear another voice, even if it was just for reassurance. I texted my best friend Katie, but there was no reply. She was probably asleep. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. I sat there in the dark, holding the phone in my lap, my eyes glued to the door. The tapping had stopped. The silence was even heavier now, as though it were waiting for me to make the next move. Then I heard it, a soft, drawn-out groan, like wood being bent or something heavy being dragged across the floor. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt the cold sweat gather on the back of my neck. I couldn't just sit there. I had to check. I had to know what was going on. I slowly swung my legs out of bed, the floor cold beneath my feet. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I felt a surge of hesitation. The air outside the bedroom felt thicker, almost oppressive. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't stay in the room and pretend nothing was happening. I turned the handle and stepped into the hallway, the darkness swallowing me whole. The apartment was eerily quiet now, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen the only noise. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but everything seemed just slightly off. The light from the living room dimly illuminated the edges of the hall, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The sound came again, a soft, scraping noise. It was coming from the kitchen. I was paralyzed, my feet refusing to move, my body frozen with dread. I stood at the edge of the hallway, staring down into the kitchen, but I couldn't bring myself to go any closer. I don't know how long I stood there, but after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. I took one slow step, then another, until I was standing in the kitchen doorway. The light was off, but I could make out the shape of the countertops, the stove, the cabinets. Everything seemed in its place. The scraping sound had stopped, but now I noticed something else. The chair at the kitchen table, which I had clearly left pushed in earlier, was now pulled out a few inches. Just enough to make me wonder if I had missed something. Maybe I had forgotten to push it in. But I hadn't. I was sure of it. I stepped into the kitchen, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The stillness was suffocating, and then it hit me. The temperature had dropped. The air was colder in the kitchen, much colder than the rest of the apartment. That's when I saw it. On the floor near the chair was a small puddle of water. It wasn't much, just enough to make the wooden floor glisten in the low light, but wasn't there when I had been in the kitchen earlier. I crouched down, my breath coming in quick gasps as I stared at the water. And that's when I saw it. The faint circular imprint in the puddle, as if someone had been standing there. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to know what it meant, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the spot on the floor. It was like my body was moving on its own, my hand reaching out to trace the edge of the wet mark. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Come closer. I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the spot on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the kitchen, but there was nothing, no one, just the empty, cold space. The chair still sitting in the middle of the room, slightly askew, as if someone had just vacated it. I backed away, eyes still darting around, and I didn't stop until I was back in my bedroom, door firmly shut behind me. I locked it, then slid down the wall, sitting on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest. I couldn't explain what had happened. There was no logical reason for it, no explanation for the sound, the chair, or the puddle on the floor. I had no idea if anyone could have been in the apartment. The locks had been secure. I hadn't heard any doors opening, but something had been here. I stared at my phone again. It was almost 2 a.m. now. I tried to call Katie again, but it went straight to voicemail. When I heard the sound again, the light tapping coming from the kitchen, I didn't move. I just stayed there in the dark, listening. And the longer I listened, the more I felt it wasn't just the apartment that was alive. It was something else. Something that was waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The apartment was quiet, too quiet. A stillness that seemed to hum beneath the surface, almost like it was waiting. I never liked the nights here, not after the first few days. I had moved into this building just a couple of weeks ago, a small one-bedroom unit in an older part of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable, and after the chaos of moving, I was grateful to finally have a place to call my own. I had heard rumors about the building, whispers about things that went bump in the night, strange happenings in the hallways, but I had brushed them off. Ghost stories, urban legends, the kind of things people tell to pass time. But tonight, something felt off. I had been sitting at my desk, working on some freelance projects when I noticed the clock on my wall. It was 12:42 a.m. I had lost track of time, and with the deadlines looming, I needed sleep. I stretched, the tension in my back letting me know I'd been hunched over too long, and stood up to grab my phone from the kitchen counter. As I turned to head back to my bedroom, I heard it. A faint sound, like a soft shuffle. The kind of noise you'd make if you were walking slowly across the carpet, trying not to be heard. My heart skipped a beat. I paused, listening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The sound wasn't loud, just there, something unsettling. I turned toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from my laptop screen and the dim glow from the hallway. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, the pipes creaking, or something from outside. The wind had been picking up earlier, and it often caused strange noises in the walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I shook my head and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. As I passed the bathroom, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it open, I was sure of it, but the thought didn't linger long in my mind. It could have been me, distracted, not fully paying attention. I pushed it out of my mind and stepped into the bedroom, flipping on the light. The moment I entered, I froze. The bed wasn't how I had left it. The blankets were twisted as if someone had been sitting on the edge or had tossed and turned. I hadn't moved them since I made the bed earlier that morning. I was meticulous about that. Everything had a place. But now it was as if someone had disturbed the sheets in a hurry. My pulse quickened, and I glanced over my shoulder, almost expecting someone to be standing in the doorway watching me. But there was no one. I walked over to the bed, my mind racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. The air in the room felt colder than usual, and I pulled the blanket back in place. My thoughts started to spiral. Maybe I had left the window open. Maybe there was a draft. It was cold outside, and the building was old. Things shifted when the temperature dropped. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I reached for my phone, wanting to call a friend to get some reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind, but just as I unlocked it, the sound came again. This time, it was louder. A sharp, scraping sound that seemed to come from the hallway. Something, or someone, dragging across the floor. I felt the blood drain from my face as my body went rigid. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate. I told myself to calm down. I grabbed the door handle, slowly pulling it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, but there was enough light coming from the kitchen to illuminate a small path. I stepped out cautiously, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked down the hallway, my feet barely making a sound as I moved. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the eerie silence seemed to press against me, suffocating me. The kitchen was empty, the small light above the stove flickering slightly. I looked around. Nothing was out of place except the fridge door was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't been in the kitchen since earlier that evening when I made dinner. I pulled the door open, heart racing, expecting to find something. Anything. But inside, it was just a half-empty carton of milk, a few jars, and some leftovers. Nothing unusual. But as I closed the fridge door, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. In the reflection of the oven door, there was a shadow standing in the hallway. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching in both directions. I could feel the walls closing in on me. I had to get out of there. I rushed back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me as I sat on the bed, shaking. My phone was still in my hands, and I called my friend, hoping she'd pick up, needing to hear another human voice. The ringing seemed to stretch on forever. When the voicemail finally clicked in, I left a message, my voice barely a whisper. "Hey, it's me. I don't know what's going on, but something's happening here. Please call me back." I hung up and tossed my phone on the bed, burying my face in my hands. The apartment felt like it was pressing in on me. I could still hear the faint scraping noise, almost like nails dragging across the walls. I don't know how much time passed. I just sat there, trying to breathe through the panic, willing myself to stay calm. But every so often, I'd hear something, a soft creak, a shuffle, and every time I'd snap my head around, only to find the room still, the apartment silent. The tapping started again. This time it was closer. It sounded like it was right outside my door. I could almost feel it, the pressure of something waiting just beyond the threshold. It wasn't just the sound, it was a presence. Something was there. I had to know. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and slowly approached the door. The knob was cold to the touch, but I gripped it tightly, bracing myself for whatever I might find. I pulled it open just a crack and peered into the hallway. The hallway was empty, just the shadows stretching long into the darkness. But then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. A footprint. Right in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't like a regular shoe print. The shape was odd, as though it was made with bare feet, the edges smeared like something wet had left it behind. But it didn't make sense. I was sure I hadn't walked down the hallway in hours. It was almost as if someone or something had been standing there, waiting for me to notice. I stepped back, closing the door, the click of the lock echoing in the silent apartment. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, as I collapsed back onto the bed. And then the whispering began. Soft at first, just a murmur, like someone was speaking from far away. But the sound grew louder, closer. My name, whispered again and again as if it were being called from just beyond the door. I didn't move. I couldn't. The whispering stopped suddenly, and the room fell into an even deeper silence. A silence so thick I felt as though the walls were closing in on me. I stayed there for hours, my eyes wide open, straining to hear the smallest noise, but there was nothing. No tapping, no whispering, just the sound of my own breathing, heavy in the quiet. The morning light finally filtered through the blinds, and with it the room seemed to breathe again. The air didn't feel as heavy, as suffocating. I forced myself to get up, to open the door, to step back into the hallway. But there was no sign of anything strange. The hallway was as it always was, empty, undisturbed. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. And I knew that whatever had been in this apartment with me was still here. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I moved into the small apartment at the edge of town in early 2024. It was the kind of place that people overlooked. Old, with faded wallpaper and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of mildew. The rent was cheap, which was the biggest draw. I didn't need much, just a quiet place to sleep after long days at work. The first few nights were uneventful. I had unpacked most of my things, settled into the routine of the city, and embraced the solitude. My neighbors were quiet, and the building felt safe. But that changed one Friday night, a few weeks after I moved in. It was one of those nights where the sky was thick with clouds, and the rain fell relentlessly against the windows. I had planned to relax, maybe watch a movie or read a book, but after a long week, all I wanted to do was sleep. I didn't even bother to turn on the TV or the lights. I just pulled the covers up to my chin and tried to get comfortable. But then, in the silence of the night, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A soft tapping. It came from somewhere deep in the apartment, as though someone was gently tapping on the walls. The noise was almost rhythmic, a quiet but deliberate tapping that echoed through the silence of the room. At first, I tried to dismiss it. It was an old building, after all. Pipes, settling wood, there were 100 logical explanations. But the longer I listened, the more unnerving it became. The tapping wasn't random, it was too consistent, too measured. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I wasn't imagining it. I could hear it distinctly. It was so soft that it might have been missed by someone else, but to me, in the dead of night, it was undeniable. The fear started to build, creeping slowly, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I had to check. I threw the covers off and grabbed my phone, quickly turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness of the apartment, casting long shadows across the walls. I crept to the door and paused, my hand resting on the doorknob. The tapping stopped. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited for a moment, trying to calm myself, but nothing happened. I hesitated, then slowly opened the door, careful not to make a sound. The hallway was empty. The dim light from the overhead fixture bathed the narrow corridor in a sickly glow. I peered down both ends, my eyes scanning every corner, but there was no one there. The apartment was quiet again, almost too quiet. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the old pipes or the wind outside. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I tried to go back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The tapping had unsettled me too much. I stayed awake, my mind racing, listening for any further sounds. Hours passed, and the silence remained. When I finally fell asleep, it was a restless slumber filled with strange dreams. In those dreams, I was walking through the apartment, but the walls were different, the rooms twisted and unfamiliar. I heard the tapping again, louder now, more frantic. It echoed through the house, coming from every direction. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable, and then, suddenly, I was awake. The apartment was still. The room was dark, but there was no sound, no tapping, no movement. I lay in bed, staring into the shadows, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I had to be imagining it, I thought. But then, from the hallway came a soft whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice. A low, rasping whisper that seemed to call my name. Ellie. My blood ran cold. The voice was close, just outside the door. I could feel it as though it was right next to me. My entire body tensed, and I was too terrified to move, too scared to speak. The whispering continued, growing softer, as if it was fading into the walls. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to bolt out of the apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of the bed. My body refused to move. The next few minutes felt like hours. I was paralyzed, trapped in the silence, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. But nothing happened. Slowly, the fear began to fade, and I convinced myself it was just another trick of the mind. A dream. A hallucination from lack of sleep. It had to be. The next morning, the sunlight seemed to dispel the unease that had plagued me through the night. I got up, went about my day as usual, and tried to forget what had happened. But the memory lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind, even as I went through the motions of my routine. I convinced myself that it was nothing, that I was just tired, stressed, maybe even a little homesick. That night, though, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It came from the same direction, down the hallway outside my door. It wasn't just a tapping now, though. It sounded like something being dragged, something heavy and scraping against the floor. My heart raced as I froze in place, my breath shallow. The sound continued, slowly dragging closer, as if whatever it was making its way toward my room. I was terrified, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed my phone again and crept to the door. I peered through the crack, the darkness beyond the threshold swallowing any hope I had of seeing what was happening. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. But this time, something felt different. The air felt colder, thicker, and the shadows seemed deeper, darker. I opened the door fully, stepping into the hallway. The sound stopped, but then I saw it. A figure, a shadow in the distance. It was tall and thin, its outline hazy and indistinct. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence in the way the air seemed to grow even colder. It stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the edge of the dim light. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It felt like time stood still, the seconds stretching into eternity. And then, in a moment that felt like a nightmare, the figure began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance between us with a speed that was impossible. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, floating toward me. The faint scraping sound of something dragging along the floor, the only indication of its movement. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The figure had vanished. The hallway was empty again. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't remain in that apartment one more minute. The fear had gripped me completely, and all I could think about was getting out. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I spent the night at a friend's place, unable to shake the images of what I had seen. The next morning, I went back to the building. My plan was simple: collect my things and leave for good. But when I entered my apartment, everything was as it had been before, calm, undisturbed. The door was locked, the lights were off, the apartment was empty. I couldn't make sense of it. Had I imagined it all? Was I just exhausted, letting my mind play tricks on me? But then I saw it. On the floor in the hallway, just outside the bedroom door, was a single wet footprint. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was just past midnight when I found myself alone in my small, rundown apartment in the heart of the city. I had moved in a few months ago, after my old apartment had been too expensive, and this place seemed like a better option. Sure, it was older, the kind of building with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was cheap and close to work. The kind of place people didn't think much about. That night, I had stayed up late working on some projects, and as the clock ticked past midnight, I decided it was time to go to bed. The rain outside had been coming down hard for hours, tapping against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the building. The city outside was quiet, save for the occasional distant car passing by. I had just shut off my computer and stretched when I heard the first sound. A soft, muffled thud coming from the living room. I froze, unsure if I had really heard anything at all. I was alone in the apartment, my roommate having left town for the weekend. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the building settling, a usual noise that had become familiar over the past few months. But as I stood there in the stillness of the apartment, I heard it again. This time, louder, followed by a scrape, as though something heavy had shifted on the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I stood in the darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The sound had come from the living room, the only other room besides my bedroom. I was certain I had locked the door earlier, but with the way the noise continued, I felt an inexplicable anxiety creep up my spine. I slowly grabbed my phone from the nightstand and opened the flashlight app. I held my breath as I made my way toward the door, listening intently for any more sounds. Everything was eerily quiet, except for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the windows. I stood there, my hand resting on the doorknob, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. After a few moments of hesitation, I swung the door open and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was dark, the only illumination coming from the sliver of light spilling in from the kitchen. I couldn't see anything unusual. The living room was still, nothing out of place. I was about to step back into my bedroom when I noticed it, a faint shadow moving at the corner of my eye, something that didn't quite belong. It wasn't a human figure, more of a dark, wispy blur that seemed to linger just out of sight, on the edge of my vision. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My heart began to race. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the way the light hit the walls. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I took a few tentative steps into the living room, my phone's flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The air felt colder than before, and as I moved deeper into the room, I could feel it, a presence, a weight in the air, something that didn't belong. The silence was almost unbearable. But then I heard it again, a soft thud, followed by a low, dragging sound. It was coming from the far corner of the room, near the old bookshelf. I didn't want to move. The thought of going closer made my stomach churn, but my curiosity, or maybe my fear of what might happen if I didn't, propelled me forward. As I neared the corner, I could see nothing unusual at first. The bookshelf stood untouched, the floor undisturbed. But as I shone the flashlight toward the base of the bookshelf, my breath caught in my throat. There, lying on the floor, was a single object, a key. I bent down to pick it up, but the moment my fingers touched it, I heard the sound again, louder this time. A scraping sound, like nails against wood. My blood ran cold. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The apartment was empty, silent, except for the rain outside. But that feeling, the presence, the inexplicable sensation that I was being watched, was suffocating. I quickly stood, clutching the key in my hand, and backed away toward the door. As I turned to retreat into my bedroom, I heard it, soft footsteps, like someone walking on the wooden floor behind me. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but again, there was nothing. No one. Just the dim light of my phone and the empty, silent apartment. The footsteps continued, however, growing louder, closer, until it felt as if they were right behind me, in the very room with me. I ran back into the bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My heart raced, my mind whirling with terror. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling, and dialed the number of my roommate. No answer. I dialed again, and still, no answer. Panic set in as the footsteps continued, growing louder as though they were closing in. I turned off the flashlight, trying to listen more closely. The steps didn't stop. They didn't fade away. They were constant, deliberate. I pulled the covers over my head, desperate to block out the noise, but I could still hear them, faint but unmistakable, moving through the apartment. I told myself it was all in my head, that I had been working too hard too late, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't my imagination. I don't know how long I lay there, curled up in my bed, frozen in fear. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the footsteps would return, dragging slowly across the floor. The scraping sound followed, always in the distance but growing closer. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I finally managed to drift off into a fitful sleep. But even in my dreams, I could hear it, those footsteps, always moving closer. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment was still. The rain had stopped, and the sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. I sat up in bed, confused, still shaken by the events of the night. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. But when I looked at my phone, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a message from my roommate. I forgot my key. Can you leave it in the mailbox for me? The key. I looked down at my hand where I still held the key I had found in the living room, and my stomach twisted. I had no idea where it had come from or who it belonged to, but I knew it wasn't mine. And in that moment, I realized something. The footsteps had been moving toward me, closing in on me, but they hadn't come from outside my room. They had been in the apartment, and I was the one who had been alone. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the middle of January 2024 when I first moved into the old townhouse on the edge of town. I was in between jobs and needed a cheap place to stay until I found something permanent. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Graves, had shown me around the place, and while the house was small and a little rundown, I liked the idea of being away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It was quiet, tucked away from the main road, and the rent was affordable. The first few nights were uneventful. I settled into the routine of being alone, working from home during the day and curling up with a book or a movie at night. The house was cold despite the heater running full blast, but that didn't bother me too much. I had lived in older houses before, and drafts were just part of the deal. But one evening, about a week after I moved in, things started to feel different. It was just past midnight, and I was finishing up some work in the living room. The only light in the house came from the dim glow of my laptop, and the wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. I was about to call it a night when I heard something, a soft creak, followed by a distinct tap, tap, tap sound. I paused, my fingers frozen on the keyboard. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs, from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe the house settling or the wind making the floors groan. But the tapping continued, more rhythmic this time, as if someone was walking slowly down the hallway, dragging something heavy behind them. I tried to ignore it. After all, I was alone in the house. There was no one else who could have made that sound. But it persisted. I stood up and walked toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the bottom of the staircase and looked up into the darkness, feeling a chill run down my spine. I hesitated. The thought of investigating was terrifying, but at the same time I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sound had been so deliberate, so purposeful. Taking a deep breath, I made my way up the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint moonlight filtering in through the windows at the end of the hall. As I walked closer to my bedroom, I could still hear the sound, now much clearer, a slow, dragging noise. I reached the door to my room and pushed it open. Nothing. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed, the air heavy with the cold. I was about to close the door when I heard it again, the tapping, only this time it was coming from inside my room. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the room was empty. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I stepped into the room, the sound of my own breathing the only noise in the stillness. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps the house's old foundation making strange noises. But then I saw it. At the far corner of the room, near the window, was a faint outline, a dark, shadowy figure standing motionless against the wall. My stomach turned, and I froze. The figure was tall, human-shaped, but the shadows around it made it difficult to see any details. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was as though my body had gone numb, caught between the fight-or-flight instinct and a paralyzing fear. I watched, my breath shallow, as the figure remained still. The air around me grew heavier, colder. Then, without warning, it moved. It was slow at first, the shadow gliding across the floor toward me, its movements smooth and unnerving, like something not quite human. The tapping resumed, now louder, more pronounced with each step it took. My legs finally gave way, and I stumbled backward toward the door. My heart raced, my mind unable to process what was happening. The figure didn't stop. It kept moving, getting closer with each second. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I leaned against the door trying to catch my breath, but the sound, the dragging, the tapping was still there. It was coming from the other side of the door, as if the figure was waiting for me. The thought of running out of the house crossed my mind, But I didn't want to leave, didn't want to face whatever was out there. I stayed there, trembling for what felt like hours, unable to move. Eventually, the sound stopped. The house grew silent once more, but the air still felt thick, as though something was lingering, watching. I stayed up the entire night, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The house was as still as ever. The next morning, I felt exhausted but relieved that the night had passed. I went about my day, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the night before. I had to tell myself that I had imagined it, that I had let my mind play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. That evening, I decided to call Mrs. Graves, just to ask if she knew anything about the house. She answered on the second ring, her voice as kind as ever. "Oh, honey, you're having trouble, aren't you?" she said, as if she had been expecting my call. I hesitated before answering. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Graves sighed. "This house, it's been here a long time. You're not the first to hear things, to feel like something's not quite right." I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean by that?" "Some people say they hear footsteps or things moving when they shouldn't be," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "There's a history to this house, you see. It's been passed down through generations, and not all of them were good people. Not everyone who's lived here, well, let's just say not everyone left on their own terms." I felt a lump in my throat. "What happened to the others?" There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice now trembling. "There was an accident, a family, years ago, a fire. The mother, well, they say she never left. She's still here. I'm not sure what she wants, but she doesn't like to be disturbed." I stood there in silence, the weight of her words settling heavily in my chest, the tapping, the shadow, the cold presence. It all made sense now. There was something in the house, something that had been there long before I arrived. "I'm sorry, honey," Mrs. Graves continued. "I should have warned you, but I didn't want to scare you." I didn't know what to say. My thoughts were racing, my mind trying to process everything she had just told me. I had been alone in that house, and now I realized I wasn't truly alone at all. That night, I didn't sleep. The sounds came again, the tapping, the dragging. This time, they were louder, more persistent. I could feel the presence in the room with me, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. The next day, I packed my things and left the townhouse. I couldn't stay there, not with the fear that something was watching me, waiting. As I closed the door behind me for the last time, I heard it one last time, the soft tap, 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 coming from somewhere deep inside the house. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was a cold winter evening in December 2024 when I found myself alone in my apartment for the first time in weeks. My boyfriend, Jake, had gone out of town for work, and I had the entire place to myself. At first, I was relieved to have a few days of quiet, but as the evening wore on, the apartment began to feel different, like it was closing in around me. The apartment was in an older building, the kind where the walls creaked and groaned, flat, and the floors were never perfectly level. I had lived there for a while, but that night something felt off. The heat was working fine, but the air was colder than usual. As I walked from room to room, I could hear the faintest of sounds, distant creaks and taps, like someone walking around in another room. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the building settling or the wind pushing against the windows. But as the night went on, the noises became more persistent. A soft thud from the living room, a scraping sound from the hallway. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. A knock, 3 short raps on the door. I froze. No one was supposed to be visiting. I wasn't expecting any deliveries, and Jake wouldn't be back for another 2 days. My heart started to race, and I cautiously walked over to the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing, just the empty hallway. I was about to walk away when I heard it again. Soft, slow, deliberate. A gentle knock on the door, followed by a faint scratching sound. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. Who could it be? I didn't recognize anyone from the hallway, and there was no reason for someone to be knocking at my door this late at night. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Jake's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried calling a couple more times, but the calls wouldn't go through. I couldn't explain why, but something deep inside told me not to open the door. I sat back down on the couch, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes passed, and the knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat in the dark, listening for any sounds, but there was nothing. Only the muffled hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building. Then, without warning, I heard a noise from the bedroom. It was a soft rustling sound, like someone was moving around in there. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest, and slowly made my way down the hallway. I reached the bedroom door and pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. I checked the closet, the bathroom, even under the bed, but there was no one there. Just the usual mess. Clothes scattered on the floor, the bed unmade. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. I went back to the living room, trying to calm myself down. I grabbed a glass of water and sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a movie. But every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made me jump. The apartment seemed to be alive, its every movement a reminder that I wasn't the only one there. Around midnight, the noises started again. First, it was a faint rustle, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Then came the tapping, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the hallway, and it sounded closer this time. I stood up, my legs weak, and walked toward the hallway. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I felt like I was being watched. I moved carefully, trying not to make a sound, and as I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood a figure. It was tall, but its features were blurred, as if the shadows themselves had taken form. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it watching me. Its presence was so heavy, so palpable, I could feel it in my bones. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, as still as death. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It was fast, too fast. It glided toward me, its shadow stretching along the walls, and I stumbled back, falling to the floor. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears, but before I could reach the door, the figure was right in front of me. It was like it was in my head, in my soul, its presence suffocating me. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, but when I finally managed to tear myself away, the figure was gone. The apartment was silent once more, as though nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, that figure, standing just out of reach. It haunted me, a presence I couldn't escape. In the morning, I called Jake. I told him everything that had happened. At first, he didn't believe me. He thought I was just overreacting, that it was the wind, the old building settling, but I knew what I saw. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Later that day, Jake came home early, insisting that we move out of the apartment. I agreed, though part of me felt guilty for not being able to stay in the place I'd once found so comforting. But every night after that, the sounds came back, softer at first, but then louder, more insistent. The figure never returned, but the apartment never felt the same. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. We eventually left, finding a new place in a different part of town. But the experience haunted me for months. Every time I passed the old building, I felt that chill crawl up my spine. I never told anyone else what had happened that night, too afraid they wouldn't believe me. Even now, when I'm alone at night, I can still feel the weight of that presence, like it's waiting for me to return. I know it sounds crazy, but I've learned to listen to the silence, and when the noises come again, I'll know that I'm not alone. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. Growing up, I'd heard all sorts of tales about haunted houses and restless spirits, but I never believed them. They were just stories to entertain or scare kids, nothing more. That was until I found myself living alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city in early 2024. I had recently moved into the apartment after leaving a bad relationship and a crammed living situation with roommates. This place was small, but it was mine, and it was in a quiet area with a good view of the city. It was the perfect place to start over. I didn't know much about the building's history, and I didn't ask. I figured it didn't matter. After all, I wasn't one to entertain superstitions. The first few nights were peaceful. The apartment was quiet, and the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that kept me company at night. I was working from home and had settled into a comfortable routine. But then, after about a week, things started to change. Little things at first, small noises in the dark. It started one night when I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone. I had just finished working on a freelance project and was ready to sleep. It was well past midnight when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the hallway. I sat up in bed wondering if I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails gently rapping against the wood. I told myself it was nothing. The apartment was old. It creaked and settled, especially when the temperature dropped at night. Still, the noise lingered in my mind, and I found myself listening intently, waiting for it to come again. But after a few more moments, the noise stopped, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next few nights were similar. The tapping continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always at night, always when I was alone. The first time I told a friend about it, they laughed it off. "You're just hearing things," they said. "Old buildings make noise." But one night, the tapping wasn't the only sound. I was in bed, the room dark except for the faint light from the street lamps outside. The tapping came again, but this time it was followed by a soft, dragging noise, like something being moved across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. The noise was unmistakable, coming from just beyond the bedroom door, in the hallway. I tried to convince myself it was the building settling, but the dragging sound felt different. It was too deliberate, too clear. I lay frozen in bed, trying not to move, my mind racing. What could it be? A mouse? A raccoon? But it was too loud and too rhythmic for that. I forced myself to get up, my hands trembling as I reached for the light switch. I flicked it on and slowly opened the bedroom door, peering into the dark hallway. The apartment was eerily silent now. No more tapping, no more dragging, just the heavy quiet of the night. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I checked the living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom, and found nothing. The apartment was empty. I went back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next few nights, the sounds grew more frequent, more distinct. The tapping would start around midnight, followed by the dragging. Sometimes it felt like it was right outside my bedroom door. Other times it seemed to come from farther down the hall, like someone was moving around in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I called my landlord, asking if anyone had reported strange noises in the building. "Oh, that place is old," the landlord said. "The building creaks. I'm sure that's all it is. Nothing to worry about." But something in the back of my mind told me it wasn't just the building settling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me. It was a feeling that grew stronger every night. I tried to get some rest, but sleep didn't come easily. I started leaving the lights on, but that didn't help. I kept hearing the same sounds, the tapping, the dragging, and sometimes faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I felt like I was losing my mind, but the noises were real. They were happening. One night, I had had enough. I decided to confront whatever it was. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I stepped out of bed and walked to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway was silent. I looked up and down the long corridor, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my hand, scanning the apartment. I walked cautiously to the living room where I had left some empty boxes. I shined the light around, my mind racing. There was nothing except the feeling of being watched. Then I saw it. At the far end of the living room, just under the window, there was a shadow. It wasn't a shadow cast by the streetlights or the blinds. It was darker, more solid, like it was part of the room itself. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow shifted as if something had moved within it. I was too terrified to breathe. I stood there staring at it, wondering if I was imagining things. But the longer I looked, the more real it became. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the shadow moved again. Slowly, like it was aware of my presence, and I saw it, just for a split second, shift toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Before I could make a move, the shadow vanished, disappearing into the dark corner of the room. I blinked, unsure of what I had just seen. Had it been my imagination? A trick of the light? I quickly turned on every light in the apartment, flooding the rooms with brightness, but the shadow was gone. The room felt empty. I walked cautiously to the corner where I had seen it, shining my flashlight over the floor and walls. There was nothing there, no trace of the shadow. I stood there, my pulse racing, trying to convince myself that it was just my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Something had been in the apartment with me, and it was still there. That night, I slept with the lights on, but I didn't sleep well. Every little noise sent me into a panic. The tapping, the dragging, the whispers, they all returned. I couldn't escape them. They were part of the apartment now, part of my reality. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do. I called a paranormal investigator. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know if there was something in that apartment or if I was losing my mind. The investigator arrived a few hours later. He was an older man with a calm demeanor that helped ease my anxiety. We walked through the apartment together, and he asked me about the noises and my experiences. I explained everything, the tapping, the dragging, the shadow. "Have you experienced any strange cold spots?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, especially in the hallway." He smiled gently. "I've seen this before. Older buildings can sometimes carry residual energy. It's not always a bad thing, but sometimes the energy can manifest in ways we don't understand." I watched as he set up a few devices, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and other equipment, and started his investigation. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was just an old building. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But then, around 2 a.m., the tapping began again. The investigator turned to me with a serious expression. "It's real," he said quietly. I had no words. I just stood there, listening to the tapping grow louder, then the dragging, followed by a soft whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The investigator nodded grimly. "Whatever it is, it's not malevolent, but it's here, and it's been here for a long time." He suggested I leave for the night, and I didn't hesitate. I packed a bag and went to stay at a friend's house. When I returned the next day, the investigator had finished his work. He told me he had performed a cleansing, but the presence might not be entirely gone. I don't know what's still in that apartment. I still hear the tapping sometimes when I'm home alone, but it's quieter now, less frequent. I don't know if the cleansing worked or if something is still lingering in the shadows. All I know is that I don't feel alone anymore, even when I'm the only one in the room. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I had moved into my new apartment a month ago. The building was an older one, situated at the edge of town. I didn't mind the creaky floors or the fact that the walls were paper thin. I was used to city noise, and I liked the idea of having a place all to myself. Besides, the rent was cheap, and I had no complaints, at least not at first. My apartment was on the top floor, a cozy one-bedroom with a view of the city's skyline. The windows were a little old, letting in the chill of the evening air, but I didn't mind. It gave the place a certain charm, like something out of an old movie. The first couple of weeks went by without incident. My days were spent working from home, and my evenings were quiet. I would occasionally invite a friend over, but mostly I spent my nights alone. But it wasn't long before things began to feel different. One Friday evening, I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone. It was just after midnight. I had a habit of staying up late, working on side projects or watching old shows. The building was as quiet as usual. No sounds from the street below, no neighbors walking through the hallways, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then I heard something that made me freeze. A soft knock. 3 quick raps on the door. I glanced at the clock. It was so late. Who could possibly be knocking on my door at this hour? I stood up cautiously, my mind racing. I didn't expect any visitors, especially not at this time of night. I walked to the door, hesitated, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when I'd last checked. I opened the door slowly, stepping out into the hall. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls. I looked both ways, but there was no one there. I frowned, closing the door behind me. Maybe I had imagined it. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. I returned to the living room and sat back down, turning on the TV to distract myself. But the feeling of unease lingered. Every time I heard a sound, I jumped. The occasional creak of the building seemed louder now, more pronounced. It was like the place was alive, watching me. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and tried to focus on the show. But just as I was about to relax, I heard it again. This time, it was more than just a knock. It was a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. A soft, dragging noise, like something or someone was moving slowly. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up again, my pulse quickening. The apartment was silent again, but my mind raced. I wanted to check to see if someone was playing a prank on me, but my feet were frozen to the spot. I stood at the threshold of the living room, staring down the hallway in the dim light, too terrified to move. The noise continued. It was almost as if someone was dragging something heavy along the floor. Slowly, methodically, step after step, it was moving closer. I had no explanation for what I was hearing, but I couldn't deny it. The noise was real. My legs finally moved. I made my way down the hall, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was eerily quiet, nothing out of place. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved closer to the source of the noise, which seemed to be coming from my bedroom. I stood at the bedroom door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. The bed was neatly made, the desk piled with papers. It looked just like it always did. But then, something caught my eye. At the far corner of the room near the window, there was a faint smudge on the floor. A dark, uneven stain, like someone had dragged something heavy across the carpet. My heart dropped into my stomach. I knelt down to inspect it more closely. It was strange. There was no way something could have caused that mark. I hadn't seen it before. And there was no logical explanation for it being there now. I turned around, my body suddenly overcome with a sense of dread. It felt like something was behind me, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, like I wasn't alone in the room. A chill ran through me. The air had grown colder, and I pulled my sweater tighter around me. I needed to leave, to get out of that room, but I couldn't make my legs move. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed by the weight of the moment. And then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. Leave. It was so quiet, so faint, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it or if it was real. But the voice, it sounded so clear, so close. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. My pulse was racing, my heart pounding in my ears. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my phone and tried calling Jake, but he didn't pick up. I tried again, but nothing. The apartment was eerily quiet again, and I could feel the presence of something unseen, lingering in the air. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, pacing the apartment, unable to relax. I heard more noises, whispers, faint footsteps, the soft tap-tap-tap of something moving along the walls, the creaking of the floorboards, the sound of someone breathing just out of sight. By morning, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept a wink, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. I knew I couldn't stay another night in that apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in there with me didn't want me there. I packed my things quickly, throwing clothes into a bag, desperate to get out. I didn't care about the rent or the inconvenience of moving again. I just needed to leave. When I finally called Jake again, he answered. He was surprised to hear from me, especially since I had left several messages earlier. I explained everything, told him about the knocks, the dragging sound, the voice. He didn't believe me at first. He thought I was just imagining things, that maybe I was stressed from work or something. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been there, watching me, waiting for me to leave. We decided to go back to the apartment together. I packed up the last of my things and we left as soon as we could. That night, we stayed in a hotel. I couldn't bring myself to return to the apartment after what had happened. It wasn't just the strange sounds or the feeling of being watched. It was the voice, the whisper that had told me to leave. It was too real, too personal. Jake never fully understood what I experienced. He said he didn't hear anything when we went back to the apartment, but I know what I felt, what I heard. There was something in that place, something dark that didn't want me there. I never went back. I found another apartment a few weeks later, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear that faint whisper echoing in the back of my mind, leave. Story the end.